All right, welcome. We have two lessons in one PowerPoint. Good for you, good for me, because one less video. All right, so section 2.3, human niches and population, as well as section 2.4, referred to as ecosystem services. Please remember to do the key terms. Okay, the human niche. We've talked about niches or roles of organisms, of other animals, but what about humans? What niche do we occupy? So unlike other organisms, humans can adapt to many different ecosystems, and we basically make our own niche. We sort of just do our own thing, right? To occupy such a broad, we must use the ecosystems we inhabit in a sustainable way. Now, this is a key thing. We have to do that. We don't, but we should. And so what is sustainable use? Use of a resource that does not lead to long-term depletion, depletion means going away, reducing, or affect the diversity of the ecosystem from which the resource is obtained. That is sustainable use, right? We really should be affecting ecosystems as little as possible, as well as not depleting or getting rid of resources, right? Because oftentimes what humans do is we use resources so that they can't be produced again, right? Which animals don't do, right? So sustainable use of resource allows the resource to meet the needs of present and future generations, which makes sense, right? That's an obvious, point there. So humans and carrying capacity. So populations of all species, including humans, tend to increase exponentially until their carrying capacity is reached, right? We mentioned that before, that exponential growth. But we said that exponential growth can't occur forever in humans, in animals, right? We said that exponential growth will be limited because the animal will reach its carrying capacity, and then it'll find balance, right? Equilibrium. But human exploitation of natural resources has produced improvements in public health, education, agriculture, medicine, and technology. Those are all good things. But what does that do? It has increased the carrying capacity for humans. So all of these advances that we make are actually increasing our carrying capacity, but what does that mean? If you increase a carrying capacity, it means that the population is going to be using more resources, right? So it's sort of like a double-edged sword here, is that as we push public health, which is great, right? It means that people aren't dying from simple diseases before, right? Because even our public health, just the past 100 or so years, if you think about 1915 even, mortality from infant mortality or women dying during childbirth was still a pretty risky thing, right? That was still something that had very high rates of death of children as well as women giving birth, right? Unfortunately. So as our knowledge of medicine has gone up, it means that people can live longer, right? But what does that also mean is that we're using more resources, right? So not to say that, okay, let's just get rid of, okay, let's just start killing people. But it just means that we have to be more conscious about how we're using these resources, right? As we make these advances, we have to sort of be thinking long term as well, right? So we can do these great things which save lots of people's lives, but at the same time, it means that, well, now there's a bit of responsibility on the rest of us because we can't keep doing this forever. We can't keep consuming as much as we do forever. Another term here is doubling time, which is the time period required for a population to double in size, right? So about 400 years ago, human population growth was very slow and steady. Early 1600s, so that's the 17th century to the early 19th, human population doubled from a half billion to 1 billion in a doubling time of about 200 years. So in this time period, about 200 years was all that it took for our population to double, right? Very significant there, considering our population growth prior to that, right? Also remembering that various epidemics of the past were wiped out lots of humans in the past. But really about the 1800s, usually the advent of what's called the Industrial Revolution, we start seeing human population growth gets exponential and starts increasing very, very fast. So the human population currently stands at more than 6.7 billion. I think we're at 7. I could be wrong, with a doubling time of about 60 years. So remember that this information comes from our textbook, Our textbook is from before 2010, I think. So this data is a little bit old, but for our purposes, we can use this data in here. There might be maybe a more accurate number out there now currently, but why don't we just stick with this with these values here because they serve the same purpose, right? And we're trying to learn about sort of maybe the science history here as opposed to the current, right? If you take biology, population dynamics, human, whatever, geography, when you take those into university, they will give you the accurate numbers. But for now, let's just try and get the concept down with some of these maybe a bit easier numbers to deal with. Because we also have looking backwards is beneficial because we can figure out how these numbers apply back then, as well as maybe even see how they affect us now. So a graph, exponential growth here again, billions of people. So this is human population with year. So obviously, the older we go back in time, the less accurate our these are all estimates of population just from these ancient sources. But once we get into more modern times, like 1800, we have a better idea of how many people there are, and obviously our contemporary numbers will be very good, right? So we see that over time, it's pretty much steady, not a lot of growth. A little dip down here, interestingly, at 1400. It says right here. It says deadly plague, anyways, because we zoom in. Notice that on the right, this graph is a zoom in of this little dip right before we start going exponential. It says deadly plague. Why don't you take a minute, think about what plague you think that is. So pause the video, come up with an idea. Yeah, so if you said the Black Plague in Europe, then you are correct. The bubonic, I think is what it's called. Basically, the Black Plague is what it's referred to kind of commonly. I forget the exact pathogen that it was, but in Europe, this wiped out 1/3 of Europe's population around the 15th century. There were lots of plagues throughout history that wiped out significant portions of human population, but this was a big one. And like I said, 1/3 of Europe's population was wiped out by this, which is very interesting. But what happens shortly, not too long afterwards, just a couple hundred years, and we see that the Industrial Revolution occurs, and then, human population goes up very significantly, right? So in the aftermath of this deadly plague, you see that as the population goes up, that's a really good thing. But then all of a sudden, it really just skyrockets, right? Because we have sort of like modern medicine. We have what's it called, automation. All sorts of advances that really start seeing our population go up. And look at where we are now. We're almost like 6 billion. Like, that's insane. Haven't had this many people in all human history. Scientists believe the biosphere, remember the biosphere is all living things on Earth, right? Carrying capacity for human population will be unable to sustain 9 to 10 billion people expected by the end of the century, right? So by the end of the century, so we are in 2020, so we have 70 years, 70, good math. 2020, we have 80 years until 2100. And our population will probably reach about 9 or 10 billion by that point, but that is beyond our carrying capacity. So, yeah, interesting thing to think about. Okay, so what are we going to do about that, right? It seems kind of scary looking into the future. So some things that we can do now. Let's talk about this term ecological footprint and how it relates to carrying capacity. So this term ecological footprint is a measure of the impact of an individual or a population on the environment in terms of energy consumption, land use, and waste production. The average person in developed countries have very large ecological footprints. What that means is that in a world that has finite resources or limited resources and is dependent on non-renewable fossil fuels, we talked about fossil fuels before, right, that they will run out. These large ecological footprints will be unsustainable. Something that is unsustainable is a pattern of activity that leads to a decline in the function of an ecosystem. So you can picture like a footprint, like an ecological footprint. It's called that because, if you've ever been, when it snows and everything, when that first snowfall, and there's no footprints. The snow is completely undisturbed. It looks very like pristine. It looks very pretty. You know what I mean? But then like once start people walking on it, it's not as nice looking anymore. So the idea here is that the footprint that you make is how much you're disturbing that niceness. So by the larger the footprint, the more disruption or disturbance that you're going to cause. So that's what's called an ecological footprint, how much disturbance a population or an individual is causing to ecosystems, to the environment, basically, right? So a large ecological footprint is a bad thing. We all individually as well as collectively want to try and reduce or decrease the size of our ecological footprint. Modern societies are trying to establish ecological footprints that reflect the principles of sustainability. And remember, to be sustainable is use of resources, land or water, at levels that can continue forever, right? We shouldn't have to worry about reaching our carrying capacity. If we are sustainable and if we can live sustainably, we can reach our carrying capacity with no problem, and we won't exceed it. We'll find that equilibrium or that balance, right? So just a graph of the footprints of some countries. So you can think about this. What are some ways that you can reduce your ecological footprint? We're going to talk about this in a bit more detail. We'll probably do an assignment on it as well. But just stuff to think about for now. Ecosystem services now are benefits experienced by organisms that are provided by sustainable ecosystems. And here are a list of 9 examples of ecosystem services. I'm going to advance, so pause if you want to read them all. Influence of forest on climate. So trees extract huge amounts of water from soil. On hot days, this water escapes through the stomata, like we mentioned, through the process of transpiration, adding water vapor to the atmosphere, right? So that's significant. This helps to reduce temperatures and form rain clouds, right? So when large forest areas are cleared, the local annual precipitation gets hotter and drier. The clearing of large forested areas can therefore lead to what's called desertification, right? So desertification, notice that the word desert is in it, right? The change of non-desert land into a desert, which can result from climate change and unsustainable farming or water use. So if you clear a lot of forest, you're going to change the precipitation pattern, and you can cause desertification. So the area that was once able to sustain forest, right, like a forest growth, so that's lots of trees, lots of other types of plants, lots of other types of animals, is now all of a sudden turned into a desert. Over time, sorry, not all of a sudden, but over long periods of time will eventually turn into a desert, which sees a decrease in the amount of biodiversity, specifically the number of plants and animals will go down, right? Which means that is now an area that can't sustain as much life. So the life that was there has to find a habitat or an ecosystem somewhere else, or it's going to die off. So deforestation or cutting down these forests are not a good thing to do because it can lead to desertification in an unsustainable way. So we need to build things, so cutting down trees isn't necessarily a bad thing, but doing it in a sustainable way is the challenge. Let's talk about forests and watersheds. So watershed is an area of land over which the runoff drains into a body of water. There's a little diagram here. The runoff is basically like if it rains, water that doesn't get absorbed into the shed will run off and will go to a different area. Drains by water. So watersheds that have been cleared of trees exhibit 30 to 40% increase in runoff. Soils and areas where trees have been cleared are less likely to retain rainwater. So if there's not a lot of trees, we see more runoff water, and this can actually strip the soil away, which isn't as good, right? So we will lose nutrients in the soil, like nitrogen, like we talked about in the nitrogen cycle, maybe other nutrients like phosphorus and stuff. The presence of trees, therefore, aids in climate regulation and the cycling of water and nutrients, right? So trees are obviously super important for not just taking CO2 out of the air, but also for causing precipitation and reducing the amount of runoff that we see, right? So if there's too much surface runoff, it takes away all of those vital nutrients for that area, which will again lead to desertification, right? If the soil isn't very doesn't have as many nutrients, not as many plants can grow, over time it'll probably turn into a desert. So the watershed is that area over which runoff can occur, right? It's where lots of water sort of is can be collected. Okay, insects, pollination, and vegetation. Plants reproduce through sexual reproduction. Spoilers there, obviously going to be different than animals reproduce. So male pollen from one flower fertilizes the female ovary in another flower of the same species. This is called cross-pollination, right? You're going to talk about this more in grade 10. Plants rely on animals a lot of the time to move pollen from one flower to another, right? The most common pollinators, so we refer to some of these animals as pollinators, right? Like insects, specifically honeybees, right? And other species of bees. So over time, plants have sort of relied on these organisms in order to help them reproduce, right? So this is an example of coevolution. These two organisms evolving sort of together to do these functions. So cross-pollination can also occur when pollen is transferred by wind. So not all plants require insects, but a lot of them do, right? A lot of the food we eat specifically. So self-pollination can also occur where flowers can pollinate themselves or another flower from the same plant, right? So I believe that's no longer sexual. I think that's asexual. I don't know. I don't really, sorry, biology is not my strong point. I don't really know a lot about reproduction in plants, but plants could reproduce in sort of varying ways. But ultimately very similar to the way that vertebrates or animals reproduce in terms of like you need two cells, right, to combine to make a new organism. Productivity is much greater when flowers are visited by pollinators, right? So honeybees move around, they'll get pollen from one plant and they can transfer it from, they'll get like the male, quote unquote male, no, it's not, sorry, not quote unquote, like not male in the sense that we think of male, female with humans, but we just use the term male as like the one kind of cell, right? Similar to a sperm, I guess, being brought over to the female receptor for the plants, right? In pollination there. Super important for growing, for agriculture and for growing our food, right? So we got two graphs, show two examples of plants that produce more seeds when they were cross-pollinated than when they self-pollinated. So the seed is like an egg, right? Seeds are like the eggs basically that these plants lay. And so the production of fruits, vegetables, other crops increases when plants are cross-pollinated by insects or other organisms. So we see that cross-pollination leads to more seeds than self-pollination in two different types of plants. So cross-pollination in a lot of plants can be more beneficial and can probably lead to more plants producing, right? So insects are very important for that sense, as well as aiding in decomposition. So living things have to die, obviously. Within dead bodies, nutrients and energy that has to be recycled. Otherwise, these nutrients would be sort of locked or trapped in the dead body of the organism. So it's very important that these what are called decomposers, these animals or bacteria that help break down, right? So decomposers are very vital to survival of ecosystems. So decomposition is the process that breaks down organic wastes and breaks down dead organisms, turns them from like a dead body back into just like soil, or then turns them back into nutrients in soil. So decomposition is a relationship that occurs between living organism and a dead one. So insects, bacteria, and fungi are the main organisms that serve as decomposers, and decomposition ensures that nutrients are returned to the soil, water, and air as these organisms decay. So the natural decaying process will occur, but the nutrients are extracted by fungi, bacteria, and insects to return all of this. So here's a sort of a gross example. The burying beetle is an insect that's a decomposer. It'll find the body of an animal and it'll dig the soil out from under the body. The body sinks below the surface, and the beetles then cover the body to help prevent flies from laying eggs. the adult beetles lay eggs on the decaying body, then use it to feed their growing larvae. So it is super gross, but necessary, very, very necessary, right? Because otherwise, we wouldn't be able. The nutrient cycles wouldn't work. We would have a dead end, and we wouldn't have a cycle. So we really need that. Habitat, recreation, beauty, and spirituality. Okay, so there's this concept called ecotourism, which is tourism that is sensitive to the health of an ecosystem and involves recreational activities provided by sustainable ecosystems. If you've ever been on a walk in a forest, that's ecotourism, right? There are many ways in which tourists can get recreational enjoyment from ecosystems, including hiking, snowshoeing, fishing, and kayaking, right? So there's lots of, especially in Ontario and Canada in general, lots of ecosystems that we can enter into in order to get some sort of enjoyment out of it, right? And we have to make sure we treat these places sustainably. Others appreciate the beauty landscape of sustainable ecosystems through art and photography, as well as the Indigenous people of Canada have a long-lasting complex spiritual tradition connected to the ecosystems that they occupy, right? The seal hunt is an example in northern, in the Inuit communities, where it's part of a cultural tradition, and like we talked about, with the fur seal trade, fur seals and stuff were hunted quite a bit, not only by Indigenous, but by settler communities, European settlers. So bit of a contention there, I think, with seal population, but it is an example of something that is connected to the culture of the Indigenous Canadians. And so something to think about, just to be aware of that it is out there. But ultimately, the way our sort of the settler colonial way of life sort of threw the balance off of a lot of the way that the Indigenous Canadians were to live. So when we tour these places all over Canada, we have to remember that we should be trying to protect these places, right? And so we do protect them, which is nice because we have national or provincial parks, which are conservation areas, which are present in order to allow us to enjoy these natural spaces in a way that also lets animals live there, right? So remember that the rule of if you're going to go on a hike anywhere is to basically only leave your footprints, right? So you don't want to leave any garbage, you don't want to pick any flowers, you don't want to touch anything, and you want to stay on the trail. That's very, very important for any conservation land, as well as any provincial or federal park, national parks. And a quick note on that is I'm eating an apple, I'm just going to throw my apple core into the woods. Not a good idea, right? I know that it's not the worst thing. It's better than putting a plastic wrapper, okay? But keep all your garbage with you. Bring a little plastic bag or something so that if you're going to have a snack on your hike, keep your garbage with you and throw it out with the rest of the human garbage. The apple that you're bringing with you, it is not probably native to Canada, right? Or to wherever you're going, right? Even if it is, you should be keeping all of your garbage and stuff with you, no matter how natural it is. If you drop something, and obviously that's a bit different, but I just wanted to point that out because that's an important thing. Because when I was younger, I used to think that it was okay to just do that, but I have since become enlightened. Okay, great. So that's pretty much it for chapter 2. Hopefully the lessons were good, and we'll talk soon, guys.